We're going to talk about photosynthesis, and I'm going to give you in this video an overview of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is the process that is responsible for providing nutrition for most of the organisms living on Earth. Now, organisms in general are divided based on their source of nutrition. They're put into different classes. So organisms that can fix inorganic carbon and those who don't are classified differently. So inorganic carbon is like CO2. CO2 is an inorganic molecule. So if you're going to decide which class an organism belongs to, you ask a question, does this organism fix inorganic carbon? If the answer is no, the organism is put into the class of prototrophs. If the organism can fix inorganic carbon from the environment, then we call it autotroph. Auto means comes from the word automatic. That means they can capture inorganic carbon from the environment on their own. They don't need help, unlike prototrophs, which prototrophs depend on autotrophs for fixing carbon. So then, in order to fix inorganic carbon and turn it into a source of chemical energy, there is a need for input of energy, and that input of energy can come from different places depending on where organisms live. So organisms usually that live in an area where they're exposed to light, they use light, but the ones who don't, they use a chemical source of energy. These are usually organisms and bacteria that live in thermal vents in the bottom of the ocean where there is no light, and in those thermal vents there are chemicals there that these bacteria that live there can use as a source of energy. And those organisms that can capture the energy of light and use it to convert inorganic carbon into organic molecules and ATP and source of energy for themselves are called photoautotrophs. Those who can't are called chemoautotrophs. So when we talk about photosynthesis, we're talking about organisms that are capable of fixing inorganic carbon, and they use light energy as a source of energy to basically make turning inorganic carbon into larger organic molecules possible. Photoautotrophs. So some of the examples of autotroph, in here this is a plant, that's algae, that's another picture of an algae. These are these little organelles that are in here. These are chloroplasts. This is the thermal vent that I was talking about, that is at the bottom of the ocean, and these bacteria that live in these areas use some form of the sulfur molecules that come out of here as a source of energy. Heterotrophs are organisms that depend on prototrophs for living, which is pretty much most of organisms that are living on Earth, like these deers that eat plants and run around. Okay, so how does photosynthesis work in general? Well, the plant is able to absorb the energy of light, and it fixes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and it takes water from the ground, and in combination of these things through a series of, it's a pathway that is a series of reactions, it makes sugar, which is a source of, is used as a source of energy for the plant itself, and also for those organisms that eat the plant, that are dependent on it. And a byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen. So chloroplast is the organelle that makes photosynthesis possible. So we are going through a stepwise magnification of what's on a leaf. So here's a leaf, and if you were going to magnify a small part of it, you go to the second panel, and there are different layers in these plants. You have upper epidermis, if you want to think about it as form of a skin of this leaf, and then on the bottom you have the mesophyll layer, which you have cells that have these chloroplasts in them. And then you have the lower epidermis, and in the lower epidermis usually there are openings in between some of these cells, the lower skin if you like, where the cell can exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen with the environment. Now if you blow up one of these cells, you can see that the individual chloroplasts in here, and if you blow up a chloroplast, you can see the organelle. It's a double membrane organelle that has also internal membranes in it. And it is these stacks of membranes that are responsible for capturing light. In fact, actually, there are molecules on these membranes that are responsible for capturing the energy of light. So looking more closely at a chloroplast, so a chloroplast has a double membrane. It's the inner and outer, and inside of it, it has these stacks of membrane. The membranes are called thylakoid. Individual stacks of membrane are called thylakoid membrane, and when you get a whole stack of them, it's called granum, and we have many granum, it becomes grana. So that means many of these stacks of membrane. The soup inside a chloroplast is called a stroma. Now, as I mentioned, the components of the chloroplasts that are involved in capturing the energy of light are sitting on these thylakoid membranes. They take water and break it down into oxygen, and also during this process they create ATP and an electron carrier molecule, and I'm going to go through this in detail later. I just wanted to show you general structure of a chloroplast. So the summary reaction for photosynthesis is written here, which you should know. 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O gives us sugar. Usually we write it here as glucose, and then the byproduct is oxygen, 6O2. So the carbon dioxide and water are the reactants of this pathway, and then products are sugar and oxygen. Now, if you take a look, you will see that some of these molecules are oxidized and some are reduced, just like cellular respiration. So in this case, CO2 is being reduced into sugar. Look at all these hydrogens that it's picking up. And then water is being oxidized to oxygen. So therefore CO2 is picking up a lot of electrons along with their hydrogen. Water is actually losing electrons and turning into oxygen. So let's take a look at the simplified overall reaction of the overall photosynthesis pathway. There are two steps, two phases of photosynthesis. The first one is light reaction. And the reason they call it the light reaction is because it's the step at which light is actually absorbed. That's when the energy of light is harvested. So during this process, this is green. This is where on those membranes that I mentioned. So light is being absorbed by these membranes, water goes in, oxygen goes out, but also you create ATP in this step and an ADPH. Now, if this looks familiar to you, that's a good reason. I mean, it kind of looks like NAD. It looks like NADH. because it is also an electron carrier. So NADP picked up an electron and became NADPH. So by capturing the energy of light, the cell is transforming the energy of light into chemical energy. So why does the cell need these chemical energy? Because it's going to use it in the next step, which is called the Calvin cycle. It is in this second step that the cell actually fixes inorganic carbon, and with the help of this input of energy, it can transform the CO2 into a more complex carbohydrate molecule. And then this process also recycles these molecules, so it gives back an ADP plus, which is an electron acceptor, and ADP plus phosphate, which can go through this light reaction and then become ATP and NADPH again. So it's nice recycling of the components in the cell. So whereas all this is happening, the light-dependent reaction happens on, as I mentioned, in the thylakoid membranes. And the next step, which we called Calvin cycle, which sometimes it's also called light-independent reaction, which I think it's a misnomer because it's dependent on light ultimately. So let's call it this Calvin cycle, happens in the stroma. So due to these reactions that happens on the thylakoid membrane, you're going to get some chemical energy of ATP and NADPH, which is fed into the Calvin cycle, during which CO2 is captured and then turned into a sugar molecule, which is called GA3P or G3P. And notice that you're not making glucose yet. In the summary reaction, one of the products was glucose, but this GA3P is going to then later on go out and it is turned into glucose later on in the plant cell. But in the Calvin cycle, the sugar product is actually a 3-carbon molecule called G3P, or some will call it GA3P, some call it G3P.